Alright guys, we're going to do something a little unorthodox today. I've been sick recently, so I haven't really been able to train, but I still want you to think about things from a security perspective. So you guys who are looking at things kind of along the prepper lines, I know many of you are looking at things from a prepper line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a scenario in counterintelligence and doing some predictive analysis on loyalties. So we've talked about this a little bit in the past. Before we've talked about money, ideology, coercion, ego. It spells out an acronym called MICE. And what we do is we use this to actually determine people's chief motivating factors, because if you can find a pressure point as to what it is that actually motivates someone, then from a counterintelligence perspective, you can then go in and apply pressure to that thing or manipulate whatever that chief motivating factor is and actually turn that individual. So for instance, if somebody is motivated by money and material, let's just say a Russian SVR intelligence officer, and basically this guy is somebody who falls into that money materialism type category, we could offer him money to actually go back in and spy on his country, or spy for us. So if he's somebody who is driven by ideology, however, who's driven by patriotism, or maybe during the Cold War era, driven by communism, driven by that ideology, that is somebody who is very, very difficult to actually flip and turn back. You would have to actually manipulate his understanding of ideology in order to get him to go back in. You would have to manipulate his understanding of communism, or maybe undermine his understanding of communism and replace that with an alternate ideology, and from there you can begin to move in. So in order to do this, what I wanted to do was I wanted to take a story from the Bible. Now, before you guys start all sucking up leather through your butt cheeks and stuff, I want you to understand that we're looking at the Bible. We're going to look at the Old Testament in particular, one particular story from a historical perspective. So regardless of what your view is on theology, on Judaism, Christianity, anything like that, regardless of what your view is, we're looking at this from a historical perspective, from a verified source that you can actually go and read and validate for yourself. So what we're going to look at is the book of 1 Samuel, and there's a couple characters in there. We're just going to write down one more. Okay, so what we have is roughly around chapter 18 through about maybe chapter 25. You have this list of characters. You have Saul, who is anointed as king. You have Samuel, who is essentially the prophet of God at this time. And Samuel, at this time, they are just coming out of a theocracy and moving into a monarchy, Saul being the first monarch of Israel. And what ends up happening is Samuel has anointed Saul as king. And from here you have Jonathan, who is the son of Saul. You have Saul's men, who is his army, and we'll get into how they play into things in a minute. You have Doeg, who is the captain of Saul's army. And then you have David, who I'm sure you probably heard the story of David and Goliath. This is David during this time period where he has not yet ascended to being King David, although he has killed the giant Goliath at this point. So basically what we have is we have a situation in chapter 21 where, well, just to give you a little bit of historical context, Saul has disobeyed Samuel. Remember that the people are still kind of blending out of this. They're coming out of this theocracy into a monarchy, and Samuel is still very highly regarded in their system. So because Samuel appoints Saul as king, the people are loyal to Saul. And what ends up happening is because he is disobedient to some of the commands that Samuel has given to him from the Lord, what ends up happening is Samuel tells Saul, you're no longer going to be king anymore. Now, this creates a little bit of a problem because technically they've already made this transition into a monarchy as opposed to a theocracy, And what ends up happening is the people are still loyal to Saul because that was the last standing order that they had received. Samuel doesn't dispute any of this, although he does tell Saul, you're not going to be king anymore, but he doesn't go out into the town per se and basically tell the people because he fears that Saul will kill him. However, Samuel does go and anoint David as being the next king. So just to give you a little bit of perspective. Now, because Saul recognizes that Samuel has appointed David as being the next king, Saul wants to kill David. However, because David is loyal to the leadership that's been appointed prior to, he is loyal to Saul. So what I know this is going to, I'm trying to give you a little bit of understanding as far as the context of the story, but we're going to start breaking this down. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at Saul's chief motivating factor. Now, one of the things that we see with Saul is that he comes from a very modest kind of upbringing. He's not rich, he's not successful, anything like this, but he is a big, strong guy, and this is one of the reasons why he gets, promoted to this, or elevated to this status of king. But one of the things that we see is because he comes in at this kind of a low self-esteem, suppressed type position, and then he is thrust into power, that principle of power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely, is actually revealed in Saul. He begins to become very egotistical, prideful. Anytime he's faced with circumstances where he's done things wrong, he's always trying to pass the buck off on somebody else. He's taking credit for some of his son's accomplishments, even though his son goes out and he slays these Philistines. Saul is basically taking credit as if he has done it, and so on and so forth. So what ends up getting revealed in Saul is that he is actually ego-driven. So we're going to go ahead and put Saul over here as ego. Alright? So the next thing that we're going to see is we're going to look at Jonathan. Now, Jonathan and David are best friends. This creates a little bit of a dilemma, and this is one of the dilemmas that I've talked about in our past study on that MICE acronym, is that many professions can be made about, I am loyal to money, I am loyal to ideology, I am loyal to coercion. You can make that kind of self-assessment all you want, but the fact of the matter is until pressure is applied, there's absolutely no way to actually determine that. We have to look at when pressure is applied to see where loyalties actually fall, to determine where somebody's chief motivating factor actually is. So Saul is now, Jonathan rather, is now placed in a dilemma where he is either going to be loyal to Saul, or he is going to be loyal to David, or even he's going to be loyal to Samuel. Now, again, we have to understand that loyalty is subjective. From Saul's perspective, Jonathan, being best friends with David, might be viewed as being disloyal. But from David's perspective, Jonathan's loyalty to him is certainly seen as loyal, but it's seen as disloyal to Saul. So understand that loyalty is not just a fixed statement, because underneath loyalty there is a motivating factor that is generating loyalty towards something or someone. So when we look at Jonathan, we see that Saul is actually trying to kill David at this point, and David goes on the run, and Jonathan is actually helping David escape. He's kind of feeding him information, and as a result, he reveals certain things about his character. Number one, Saul is king, which puts Jonathan next in line for leadership. Now, if Jonathan is next in line for leadership, his loyalty to David is actually counter to money and materialism, because he would certainly profit more from selling David out than he would certainly profit more by being loyal to Saul and selling David out than he would by being loyal to David. So we can cross off money and materialism for David, or for Jonathan rather. Coercion. Coercion, we're going to place loyalty, just blind loyalty to an individual without regard to principle or any other motivation like that, is coercive in nature, because what ends up happening is essentially this falls into the realm of peer pressure. It falls into the realm of I care what you think of me, which even though it is a self-inflicted coercive type nature, it is still coercive nonetheless. So Jonathan is not loyal to Saul, so we can see that he's not coerced in this area. However, it's possible that he could be coerced by David. However, the story doesn't really reveal that. One of the things that we see about Jonathan is that he is either loyal to David just purely based on his friendship, which would put him somewhat coercive, or he is loyal to David because he recognizes that Samuel has now appointed David next in line, which would mean that he's ideological as well. So the story doesn't really reveal too much more about his motivation other than that, but we can put him into one of those categories. So the next thing that we're going to see is Saul's men. All right, now in chapter 21, there's a scenario where David is running from Saul, and he takes shelter inside one of the temples, and basically the people of the temple, the priests, don't understand that David and Saul are having this rift right now. So they think David is still one of Saul's men. They feed him, they take care of him, and then they said, David goes on about his way. Well, as Saul catches up to the town and he goes into the temple and he begins to question the priests, he finds out that the priests have aided David and he orders their death. Now here's the thing. Saul orders the death of the priests to his men, but his men refuse the order, which means that his men are not loyal to Saul, so they are not coercive in nature. Right? Now, understand that we're painting this with an extremely broad brush. It's possible that some of the men were coercive. It's possible, this needs to be broken down even further, but I just want to give you the gist of how this gets played out in an actual scenario, in actual analysis. So, Saul's men refuse what they view as an unlawful order because they see the slaying of the priests as being anti-ideological. They see it as being anti their theocracy and their roots in that sense. So as a result, they reveal that they are ideological in nature. And that they are not coercive, they are not driven by ego and not driven by money. Because all of these things, money, self-gratification, that coercive nature can all be provided by Saul, yet they chose ideology when the circumstance arrived. So the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at Doeg. All right, Doeg is the captain of Saul's army, and what ends up happening is as Saul is presented with this opportunity to kill the priest, and Saul's men say no, Saul then orders Doeg to do it, and Doeg doesn't bat an eye. He goes in there and he slays them all. So one of the things that we can see about Doeg is that he is either one, driven by money material because Saul has the ability to provide that to him, or from the negative perspective, Saul has the ability to take that from him if he is disobedient, or two, that Doeg is coercive in nature, in which case he is just blindly loyal to Saul regardless of the principles or the morality of the decision that is actually being placed to him. So in this case here, Doeg is either revealing himself as being material driven or coercive in nature. We don't know which one. All right. The story doesn't really reveal too much more of the details behind Jonathan and behind Doeg from the particular book in order to make that kind of assessment. So David. Now, David is in a situation later on in the book, roughly 22, 23, 24 chapters. He is in a situation where he has the opportunity to kill Saul and chooses not to do it because there was at one point a time that Samuel had appointed Saul over the kingdom of Israel. So one of the things that we can see about David, and I'm running out of keys here, so I'm just going to put this over here, is that David is ideologically driven. It's not, his motivations are not driven by a blind loyalty to Samuel, but rather to a loyalty to what Samuel has said, and that is ideological in nature. So the last one we're going to look at is we're going to look at Samuel. Samuel basically gets his word from the Lord. Saul disobeys. The Lord tells Samuel, that's it. So once again, Samuel also is ideologically driven. So let's go ahead and write that down since I'm out of red. Alright, so one of the things that we're going to see here is as we're going through this scope, we can see how each individual is placed in different circumstances where they have the choice of choosing loyalty to a side. Now, like we said, loyalty is subjective. From Saul's perspective, Jonathan was disloyal, but from David's perspective, Jonathan was loyal. However, when we look at Jonathan, the question still remains, is he loyal to David, or is he loyal to the spoken word of Samuel, the fact that David is anointed as the next king? That would become, from a counterintelligence perspective, this would be my next focus, would be to create a situation where I could determine which one of these he would fall under. The same thing with Doeg. Alright? Doeg has revealed himself to being loyal to money or material gain, or loyal to just blind loyalty to Saul, which would be coercive in nature. So that would be the next area that I would focus my attention to determine how I can actually infiltrate him if he was a target for me to actually pick on. So how does this play into security? Basically what ends up happening is for some of you guys who are looking at things from a prepper perspective, you're going to have to understand that obviously there's going to be safety in numbers. I'm not going to get into all this. You can watch Pastor Joe Fox's channel, Viking Preparedness. There's tons of different groups that you can go to, and you can learn more about emergency action groups and stuff. That's not really the main focus of my channel. But what I do want to actually start to point out to you is that predictively determining loyalties is something that is going to be increasingly important for you as you begin to let people into your inner circle, so to speak, and you begin to determine their loyalties. Whittling these down from any one of these people potentially being any of these groups, I have to whittle these down and actually determine what his chief motivating factor is. I want to isolate this down to one. Now this is increasingly important because somebody who is ideologically driven, as we've seen in the case of Islam, as we've seen with ISIS and things like this, somebody who is a true ideologue. Now understand, even within ISIS, there are individuals who are there solely because it allows them to be in a situation where they can do these dastardly deeds that is just within them to do. They want to rape, they want to pillage, they want to do these things, and as a result of that, these are people who are more ego-driven, although they have aligned themselves with ISIS. By the same token, there are people within ISIS who are monetarily driven. They are driven because of what they can get out of it. However, they find themselves on a parallel path with the true ideologues. From a counterintelligence perspective, though, or even from an intelligence perspective, what we want to do is we want to determine maybe an individual's loyalty, find a way to actually infiltrate that group through that particular loyalty. So, for instance, if an individual is monetarily driven, I may target that individual by offering him money, and as a result, I can extract information. However, to offer money to somebody who is a true ideologue is not going to work. to offer money to somebody who is coercive in nature, in the sense that they just have blind loyalty to a particular figure, that also would not work. That is not their chief motivating factor. That does not mean that money does not have any draw to them, but it means that it is not their chief motivating factor. By the same token, playing up to their ego, if they are just blindly following an individual, in the case of, let's say, Bin Laden, the people who just followed and worshiped this guy, or maybe it could be a nationalistic for you guys here at home. People who are blindly following Obama, or even blindly following Trump. Playing up to their ego would not necessarily work, because that's not what their chief motivating factor is. However, we can see in the case of Saul, somebody who is driven by ego, that he can be manipulated by playing on his ego, by telling him how great he is, by telling him, this will be more beneficial for you, this will show people how great you are, this will display you in a more positive manner. Things like this, by playing on that, he can then be manipulated. Now this, like I said, is something that is particularly relevant to you guys who are putting together mutual assistance groups or things of this type nature, because determining an individual's specific motivating factor as to where their loyalty is going to fall is going to be how that group gets infiltrated. So if I can figure out where any one of these groups, if we're putting together a group out of these individuals and determining where to actually infiltrate that group, I may infiltrate this group through this guy, through his ego. Or I may infiltrate this guy here through money materialism. However, one of the things that is going to be increasingly difficult to do is to actually infiltrate the group through a true ideologue. So to infiltrate the group through a true ideologue, what you have to do is maybe go back to like Cold War scenario, where one of the things that they would do is they would actually approach either Soviet GRU or KGB intelligence officers, and they would seek to undermine communism, because if these people are actually driven by the ideology that communism is the greatest, it's the best, it's what their chief motivating factor is their belief in communism, the only way to go at that individual is not to go at him through money, coercion, ego. You have to attack communism itself. You have to undermine his faith in communism and then restore his faith in an alternate ideology, because that individual is already predisposed to being loyal to an ideology. So I hope this isn't too deep for you guys, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective on how groups are infiltrated, how you can maybe take steps to vetting individuals who are coming into your groups, so that you can actually make sure that everybody is on the same page. One of the strongest things that you can do is put together a mission statement that everybody is actually passionate and believes in, because that mission statement can become an ideology for your group, whatever that happens to be. It could be patriotism, it could be your faith, it could be whatever. But you have to create something outside of money, or just blind loyalty, or even feeding into individual ego to actually drive that group. Because otherwise what ends up happening is that group ends up splintering when pressure is applied. This is one of the reasons why military-style boot camps are put together in such a manner to actually degrade individualism and to rebuild a esprit de corps, in a sense where individuals are now loyalty and an ideology over self-worth, or over self-gain, or this type of thing. And for those who are putting together mutual assistance type groups from a civilian type background, this is going to be increasingly difficult because you don't have the ability to actually tear down that individual psyche and rebuild back on an ideology. So you're going to have to make sure that the individuals that you're actually building into your group are ideologues, or you're going to have to determine an ideology that actually everyone is passionate and driven into. So again, I hope this wasn't too deep for you guys. I wanted to give you guys something to think about and something to maybe look at some of your news events, look at the situation with ISIS, look at ideology being exported into the United States or into the UK outside of deliberate border crossings. I mean, ideologies don't have to cross borders. They can be passed through the internet, things like this. I want you to look at current events in light of how loyalties actually line up and where chief motivating factors actually fall, and apply that not just to your own personal groups, but also to current events as well. I think it'll give you a little bit of different perspective on how things actually fall. So you guys think about that and train hard.